Hunger gnawed Liam. A baker's stall beckoned. His mother had gone 4 days without food. She couldn't even cough hard enough to clear her throat anymore. The crowd shifted. The baker turned to serve a woman at the far end of the stall. Liam moved. He slipped between two market-goers, reached up, and closed his hand around the warm rye loaf. It fit perfectly under his arm. He pulled it free, turned, and squeezed back into the crowd. A woman gasped. His shoulder knocked into a stack of wooden baskets. They toppled, clattering to the packed dirt. The baker's head snapped around. He spotted the empty spot on the board, then saw Liam's darting shoulder through the crowd. He roared, "Stop! Thief! Stop that boy!" The shout boomed over the market noise. People jumped aside. Liam didn't look back. He pushed harder, elbowing through the last line of people, and broke free into the open street. His feet hit the packed dirt. The loaf pressed hard against his ribs. The baker's angry shouts echoed off the brick buildings, still ringing right behind him. Jesus stood leaning against the carved stone edge of the market fountain, his eyes fixed on Liam's darting back as the boy tore out of the crowd. The baker's shouts still bounced off the roof lines, but most market-goers had already turned back to their business, content to let the boy run. Jesus pushed off the stone with one hand, straightened his legs, and stepped onto the packed dirt street. He did not hurry. He moved quiet, keeping a gap of 30 feet between himself and the boy, letting the echoes of the chase cover the sound of his steps. A fruit vendor rolled a heavy barrel of apples out onto the street right in front of him. Jesus stepped sideways, one boot against the curb, and let the barrel pass without breaking his stride. He never took his eyes off Liam. The boy cut left into a narrow alley between brick row houses, his bare feet slapping hard against the damp cobblestones. The sound carried back clearly, sharp over the distant market noise. Jesus slowed his pace a little, to keep the sound of his boots from mixing with the boy's steps. He stepped into the mouth of the alley. The brick walls blocked the afternoon sun, dropping the temperature 10 degrees in a single step. He kept moving, soft and steady, following the echo of Liam's running feet as the boy turned another corner. Jesus' voice carried soft around the corner, cutting through the heavy alley silence. "Child, where are you running?" Liam's blood turned to ice in his veins. He didn't answer. He didn't dare look back. His feet flew faster, slapping harder against the damp cobblestones as he scrambled for somewhere to disappear. Up ahead, he spotted a pile of rotted crates stacked against the brick wall, gaping shadow pooling between the stack and the foundation. He dove for it, twisting sideways to squeeze into the narrow gap. He pressed his back flat against the cold brick, chest heaving so hard his whole body shook. The stolen loaf dug hard into his ribs, pressing against the bone with every ragged breath. He shifted his grip, and the edge of the loaf scraped against a loose crate board. The board creaked. The sound echoed loud in the tight space. Liam froze, his breath caught in his throat, stopping completely. He waited for footsteps to thunder closer, for angry hands to yank the crates apart, for the rough grip on his arm he'd been dreading since he grabbed the loaf. Seconds stretched. No one came. No shouts, no rough movements. The silence pressed in around him again, thick and heavy. Tears burned the back of his eyes, then rolled hot down his dirty cheeks. His heart hammered so hard against his ribs he thought it would burst right through his chest. He curled his fingers tighter around the loaf, pressing it harder against his body, and waited. He waited for the beating and the shame he knew he deserved. The seconds stretched so long Liam's calves began to burn from holding his crouched position. He didn't dare move. He didn't dare loosen his grip on the bread. He still listened for the heavy thud of running boots, for the angry roar of the baker, for the crash of crates being thrown aside. Instead, he heard one set of footsteps. Slow, soft, steady. Each step landed light on the muddy cobblestones, no louder than a falling leaf. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They just came closer, one after another, moving toward the pile of rotted crates. Liam held his breath so long his lungs began to ache. He pressed his head back against the brick, trying to make himself smaller, trying to melt into the wall. He craned his neck forward, squinting through the narrow gap between two crate boards, trying to make out who was coming. The light from the alley mouth still filtered through, dim and gray. The footsteps stopped, right in front of the gap. Liam's heart jumped into his throat. A shadow fell over the gap, blocking out what little light there was. He could see the woven texture of the fabric, plain and undyed, hanging straight down to the mud. It stopped right in front of his hiding spot, no more than a foot from his nose. The fabric did not move. Then the voice came, low enough that only he could hear it. No anger in it, no heat, just soft and steady, right there in front of him. Liam did not move. He did not dare breathe. He waited for a hand to grab the top crate, to yank it aside, to expose him to the light and the shame. The fabric shifted. A soft rustle drifted through the gap, carrying the faint smell of dry grass and open wind, not the sour sweat of anger that clung to the baker. The hem of the fabric lowered, pulling closer to the mud, until the edge brushed the damp ground right in front of the gap. Liam heard a soft squelch, the weight of knees sinking into the thick, wet alley dirt, pressing through the loose top layer until they hit solid ground. The person had knelt down, right there, in front of his hiding spot, so their face was level with the gap where he hid. Liam's fingers twitched around the loaf. This was not what he expected. No one had ever knelt down to him, not when he had done something wrong. The next breath the person took was soft, warm, and it drifted through the gap to brush Liam's cheek. Then the voice came again, even lower than before, so quiet it was almost a murmur, just for him. No one standing outside the alley could have heard a single word. He said, "I want to help you." Liam's throat tightened, but the tightness was not the same terror as before. It was something softer, something confused, because there was no bite to the words, no edge of punishment. He waited for the rest, for the warning, for the anger that had to come. It did not. Instead, the voice went on, still soft, still steady, right in front of his face. He said, "Do not be afraid." Liam's shoulders, which had been hunched up tight to his ears since he dove into the gap, loosened just a fraction against his own will. He still held the bread tight. He still pressed his back to the brick. But the fear that had clamped around his chest since he left the market began to unclench, just a little. Liam stayed frozen for a long 10 seconds, his mind replaying every warning he had ever heard about what happens when you steal. He had been caught stealing an apple from this same market when he was 8. The farmer had beaten him across the back with a switch, right in front of the whole crowd, until he could not sit down for 3 days. He had expected it then. He expected it now. But the soft voice had not carried a single thread of that anger. The knees had not moved to stand, had not reached for the crates. The person just knelt there, waiting, giving him space to decide. The mud under Liam's heels had soaked through to his skin, cold and sticky, and the ache in his calves had spread up to his thighs. Every muscle in his body screamed to stay hidden, to curl smaller, to let the moment pass before the anger came out. But the fear in his chest was unraveling, one thread at a time. No anger, no rush, just waiting. Liam swallowed hard, and the lump in his throat slid down slow, scraping against the raw skin. He shifted his weight, just a little, and the crates creaked soft under his movement. No reaction came from outside. No lunge, no shout. He shifted again, bracing his free shoulder against the back of the top crate, his fingers still locked around the crust of the stolen bread, pressing it hard into his ribs. He could feel the crumbs already sifting through the cracks of the crust, brushing against his skin through the thin fabric of his coat. He pushed, slow, an inch at a time. The crate scraped against the one below it, sending a rough, grating noise out into the quiet alley. Liam stopped, held his breath again, waiting for the blow. Still, nothing. He pushed another inch, then another. The gap between the crates widened, letting the gray alley light flood in over his face, and he blinked hard against the sudden brightness, his eyes adjusting to the open air. He kept one hand clamped around the loaf, held tight to his chest, and pushed the crate far enough aside that he could lean his head out and see the man who had knelt waiting for him. Jesus did not reach for the bread. He did not grab Liam's arm to pull him out. He just stayed kneeling in the mud, his face calm, and waited for Liam to step out on his own. Liam pushed the crate all the way aside, got his feet under him, and stepped out into the open alley. The loaf stayed clamped tight to his chest. He kept his eyes on the dirt between his feet, not daring to look up at Jesus' face, waiting for the order to turn back to the market. No order came. Jesus pushed himself up from the mud, brushed loose dirt from his knees, and nodded down the alley away from the market square. He said, "Lead the way." Liam blinked. He had not expected that. He had come here to hide, to wait for whatever punishment was coming, not to lead anyone anywhere. He swallowed again, and nodded, and started walking down the alley. He kept 10 feet between himself and Jesus the whole time, his bare feet slapping soft against the damp cobblestones that had dried in the sun near the mouth of each alley. The smell of fried fish and baking bread drifted out from the row house windows behind him, and the shouts of the market grew fainter with every turn. Liam twisted left, then right, then down a narrow alley that sloped downhill, his feet finding every familiar broken stone by instinct. He glanced over his shoulder 3 times. Every time he turned a corner, half convinced Jesus would be gone, or that a crowd of angry market vendors would be following close behind. Both times, Jesus just walked steady 10 feet back, hands loose at his sides. No hurry, no rush. No one followed. The brick houses thinned out, turned to weathered wood, then to open grass along the edge of the dirt road. Liam stopped in front of a tiny one-room cottage, the wooden walls gray with rot, the door hanging crookedly off a single iron hinge. The thatch on the roof had gaps where the winter wind had pulled it loose. He stopped, shifted the bread in his arms, and waited for Jesus to step up beside him. Jesus stepped up beside Liam and nodded at the door. Liam reached out, curled his fingers around the splintered wooden edge, and pulled it open. The door creaked loud on its rusted hinge, scraping against the packed earthen floor inside. The smell hit Liam first: stale sweat, fever, dried cough, the sharp tang of old medicine that had sat in a cracked jar by the pallet for weeks. He stepped over the threshold, his bare feet meeting the cool packed dirt, and paused, holding his breath to listen. A faint, rattling cough drifted from the corner, thin and ragged, cut off halfway like the body pushing it out did not have the strength to finish. Liam's grip on the bread loosened just a little. He had left her sleeping when he slipped out that morning, too afraid to wake her and tell her he was going to try to find food any way he could. He stepped further into the room, the draft from the gap in the roof brushing cold across the back of his neck. In the far corner, by the cracked stone fireplace, his mother lay on a straw pallet pushed against the wall. She had pulled a tattered wool blanket up to her chin, but her shoulders still shook with every breath. She turned her head when she heard Liam's footsteps and coughed again into the frayed cloth she held pressed to her mouth. The movement made her whole body tremble, and she sank back into the straw, too weak to hold her head up. Liam walked to the fireplace, his feet silent on the dirt, and glanced down at the wicker food basket that sat beside the hearth. It was turned upside down, propped against the stone base of the fire, every inch of woven wicker empty. No crumbs left between the strands, no forgotten piece of dried fruit tucked in the corner. Nothing. The fire had burned down to a pile of gray ash, only a faint glow pulsing at the center to keep the room from going completely cold. Jesus stepped across the threshold behind him and pulled the door closed just enough to cut the worst of the outside wind. The cottage felt quiet, save for the ragged sound of his mother's breathing. Liam stood frozen by the fireplace, one hand still resting on the edge of the cold stone hearth. The stolen loaf pressed hard against his ribs, the crust crinkling soft when his shoulders tensed. He kept his eyes on the upside-down wicker basket, not daring to turn and look at Jesus. He had expected to be turned over to the baker before he ever got home. He had expected shouting and blows and public shame that would leave him hiding in the alleys forever. He waited for the first sharp question, for the demand to hand over the bread, for the order to march back to the market with his head held down. No sharp question came. Instead, he heard the soft scrape of wood on packed dirt. He risked a quick glance out of the corner of his eye. Jesus walked toward the only wooden stool by the door, the one Liam had carved himself the winter before, when his mother could still sit by the fire and tell him stories. Jesus rested one hand on the stool's flat seat and lowered himself onto it slowly. The wood creaked once under his weight, then went still. He rested his hands loosely on his thighs and leaned back against the door's rough wooden frame. He did not cross his arms. He did not lean forward with a scowl. He just sat, his face calm, and looked at Liam. Liam's throat went tight. His fingers curled into the crust of the bread until his knuckles ached. He waited another 10 heartbeats, still waiting for the anger to spill out. It did not. Jesus just kept looking at him, his eyes soft. No judgment in his posture, no condemnation in the set of his shoulders. Then, he opened his mouth, and his voice filled the small cottage, quiet as the dust motes that danced in the thin sunlight through the cracked window. He said, "Why did you take the bread that wasn't yours?" The words hung in the still air, soft but heavy, and Liam did not move. Liam's throat tightened so much he could barely draw a breath. He did not dare lift his eyes to meet Jesus' gaze. He kept them fixed on the thin, snaking cracks that crisscrossed the earthen floor, the ones he had watched spread through the dirt the winter before, when the frost came early and bit right through the cottage walls. He shifted his weight from one bare foot to the other, and the stolen loaf dug harder into his ribs, a sharp, constant reminder of what he had done. His fingers curled tighter around the crust, the stale grain rough under his fingertips. He swallowed hard, trying to force the lump in his throat down enough to speak. The first words came out thin, barely louder than a breath. "My mother has been sick for 3 weeks." He paused, and another rattling cough came from the pallet in the corner, thin and weak, and Liam's voice cracked halfway through his next sentence. "She can't get out of bed to work. We spent our last copper on medicine 3 days ago." He swallowed again, and his shoulders started to shake, just a little. Too small to see at first, but growing until he could feel it in his jaw. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." He forced the next words out, raw and thick with unshed tears that burned the backs of his eyes. "She hasn't eaten in 4 days. I just wanted her to have something to stop the pain. Something to give her strength to get better." He stopped talking. The cottage went quiet again, save for the ragged pull of his mother's breath across the room. Liam still did not lift his head. He just stood there, waiting. Every muscle in his body braced for whatever would come next. The seconds ticked by one, each one heavier than the last. Liam's shoulders, which had only trembled before, began to shake in hard, involuntary jolts that ran all the way down his arms to his wrists. His knuckles were white, where they curled around the bread's crust, the dry grain cracking soft under the pressure. Cold sweat beaded at his hairline, ran down the side of his face, and pooled at the edge of his jaw, where it dropped onto the cracked earthen floor. He still did not lift his head, but he could feel Jesus' eyes on him, steady and unwavering. He had expected a response by now, a sharp rebuke, a demand, a hand slapping the bread out of his grasp. None came. The silence wrapped around him tighter than the cold alley shadows he had hidden in that morning. It pressed in on his ears, loud enough to drown out even the ragged sound of his own breathing. Liam bit down hard on his lower lip until he tasted blood. He could not stand the wait another second. He lifted his arm, slow and shaking, and extended the stolen loaf out into the open space between him and Jesus. His elbow locked partway through the movement, trembling so hard the loaf shifted in his grip. He forced it forward another inch, until his arm was held straight out, the bread held palm up for Jesus to take. His shoulders kept shaking, hard and unsteady, and he could not make them stop. He kept his eyes fixed on the cracks at his feet, and waited for the judgment he knew he deserved. Another beat of silence stretched between them. Then Liam felt the air shift, warm and soft, as Jesus leaned forward from the wooden stool. There was no sudden movement, no sharp intake of breath, no sound of anger coiled to strike. Liam's breath caught in his throat, because he could not place what he was feeling. There was no hot, burning shame of a raised voice, no tension of a hand raised to strike. He heard the soft huff of breath that came with a smile before he dared lift his eyes an inch. When he did, he risked a quick flick of his gaze up and caught Jesus' face. Jesus was smiling. There was no crinkle of anger between his brows, no cold sharpness in his eyes, no judgment of any kind, just quiet, steady warmth. Liam's shaking slowed, just a little, against his will. Jesus' voice came soft, lower than the cough from the pallet in the corner, but clear enough to wrap around every word. He said, "Child, I know your heart is full of love for your mother." Liam froze. The words were nothing like what he had prepared for. That love is good. It is pure. It is the kind of love that holds people up when everything else falls away. Jesus paused and leaned forward just a little more, his voice still soft, still kind, no rebuke in it at all. But taking what does not belong to you will not fix the problem you face. It will only wrap you in fear, layer over layer, and keep you walking in the dark. It will turn a desperate choice into a chain that drags you down, long after your mother is well again. The fear never leaves, not when you steal what you need. It just sits with you and pulls you back into the dark every time you think you have escaped it. Liam lifted his head fully at last, his eyes still shiny with leftover tears that had not yet fallen. He looked directly at Jesus, and for the first time since he ran into the alley, he did not flinch away from another person's gaze. He swallowed hard, and the lump in his throat scraped against the back of his tongue as it went down. He knew every word Jesus had spoken was true. He had felt the fear coiled in his stomach from the moment he slipped the loaf under his coat, the constant twisting dread that made him jump at every sudden sound, that made him check over his shoulder every 10 steps when he walked the streets. He had lived inside that fear for hours, and it already felt heavier than any weight he had ever carried. When he thought about walking back to the market, about standing in front of the baker who had chased him through the streets, about admitting what he had done out loud for everyone to hear, his stomach twisted so sharp he thought he might be sick. His fingers tightened around the bread again, instinctive, clinging to the thing he had taken to keep his mother alive. He could taste the bile rising in his throat, cold and bitter. His mother coughed again from the straw pallet in the corner, a thin, ragged sound that cut through the silence. Liam drew a deep, ragged breath and let it out slow. He nodded his head once, sharp and sure, even though his legs still felt like they might give out under him. "You are right," he said, his voice rough and thin, but steady enough to hear. "I need to fix it. I will go back with you. I will tell him the truth. I will do whatever he says to pay for what I stole." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his bare feet pressing into the cold earthen floor, and braced himself to walk out the door. Jesus pushed up from the wooden stool first, his movements slow, no hurry to force Liam into the walk he dreaded. He stepped to the door and paused, letting Liam take the lead, his hand resting light on the doorframe. Liam followed, his bare feet still tingling from the cold earthen floor of the cottage. He clutched the loaf of bread tight against his chest, his knuckles pressing white against the crusted crust. They stepped out into the afternoon sun, and Liam's eyes burned. He had been hiding in shadow so long the light felt sharp, like a physical thing against his skin. They walked down the dirt road toward the center of town, Liam a step behind Jesus, his feet dragging a little with every step. The distance stretched out longer than he remembered. Every step brought the sound of the market closer, shouts of vendors, laughter of customers, the clatter of wooden baskets on stone counters. When Liam could see the tiled roof of the market hall peeking over the row houses ahead, his breath caught in his throat. He stopped short, his feet rooted to the dirt, and the fear rose up so fast it choked him. He thought he could already hear the baker's roar, already see the crowd turning to stare at the thief. Jesus did not push him. He did not hurry him. He just turned, stood still, and waited, his face calm, no trace of impatience. The baker looked up from stacking loaves on his wooden counter, his face already hardening when he recognized the boy who had run from his stall an hour earlier. His hand curled around the wooden rolling pin. He kept leaning against the counter edge. Seconds stretched out, thick and heavy enough to touch. Liam did not move. He kept his head bowed, kept his arm out straight, and waited for the blow. He heard the baker shift on the other side of the counter. He heard the scrape of wood on wood as the rolling pin was set down instead of lifted. He heard heavy boots step over the edge of the wooden counter onto the packed dirt of the market aisle. The steps moved toward him, slow, no rush. Liam's heart hammered harder, his throat still locked tight. He expected a rough hand to knock the loaf out of his grip. He expected a hard shove backward into the dirt. Instead, a large hand rested lightly on his shoulder. The weight was not angry. It was not cruel. Liam felt the shoulder under his hand squeeze once, gentle. "Look up at me, boy," the baker said. His voice was rough, not soft like Jesus, but there was no roar in it, no heat of rage. Liam lifted his head slow, his eyes still stinging with unshed tears. The baker looked at his thin face, at the sharp line of his jaw, at the way his hands still trembled. His gaze moved past Liam, to Jesus standing quiet behind him, and he held it there for a long moment. Then he sighed, a deep, heavy sound that rumbled in his chest. He took the stolen loaf from Liam's shaking hands and tucked it under one arm. "Wait right here," he said. He turned and walked back to his stall. Liam walked out of the market with the food pressed tight to his chest, the warmth of the fresh loaves seeping through the cloth and into his skin. He could still barely believe what had just happened. He had expected shame. He had expected work, hard work, to earn forgiveness, not extra bread, not cheese for his mother's empty stomach. Jesus walked beside him, slow and steady, his boots quiet on the dirt path that led out of the market toward the row of neighbors' cottages. "We will go door by door," Jesus said. "You will tell every person what you did, what you need. You do not have to hide anything anymore. Truth does not bite. It opens doors that fear keeps locked." Liam nodded, but his mouth went dry as they reached the first cottage at the edge of the neighborhood. He stopped short, 10 feet from the wooden door, and his feet would not move forward. The weight of the food suddenly felt heavy enough to pull him down. What if the neighbors turned him away? What if they called him a thief and slammed the door in his face? What if they told everyone in town what he had done, and he and his mother would never be able to hold their heads up again? He squeezed the cloth wrapped around the cheese so tight his knuckles turned white. He did not look at Jesus. He stared at the cracked paint on the doorframe, and his breath caught in his throat. Jesus did not push him. He did not yell. He just stopped beside him and waited. When Liam did not move, Jesus spoke, soft enough that only Liam could hear. "You already faced the baker. That took more courage than most men have in their whole lives. You do not have to do this alone. I am right here." Liam drew a deep, shaking breath. He let it out slow. He nodded again and lifted one foot, stepped forward until his toes touched the first step of the cottage porch. He lifted his hand. His knuckles brushed the rough wood of the door. Liam rapped his knuckles against the wood once, soft at first, then a little harder. The sound echoed through the thin door, and he held his breath. He heard footsteps inside, slow and shuffling, coming toward the entrance. The latch clicked. The door swung inward, creaking on its iron hinges, and an older woman looked out at him. She tilted her head, curious, and brushed a strand of gray hair back from her forehead. "Well, Liam," she said, "what can I do for you today?" Liam opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He closed it again, swallowed hard, and tried once more. His palms were sweating against the cloth wrapped around the bread. The cheese dug into his arm. He felt the heat of shame climb up his neck, even after all the courage he had already found that day. Jesus stood just behind his left shoulder, quiet, and that small presence gave him the push he needed. "I came to tell you something," Liam said, his voice rough at first, then a little steadier. "I stole a loaf of bread from the baker last night. My mother's sick, and we had nothing left to eat. I got caught, and I gave it back. And the baker gave me these. Jesus told me to come tell everyone what I did and ask for help if we need it. I'm sorry I didn't say anything before. I was just so scared." The older woman stared at him for a long moment, her face softening. She nodded slowly, then stepped back inside the cottage. "Wait right there," she said. She walked over to the shelf by her fireplace, reached up, and lifted a heavy glass jar. She wiped dust off the side with the edge of her apron and carried it back to the door. "This is raw honey I pulled from my hives last month," she said, pressing it into Liam's free hand. "It'll soothe your mother's sore throat when you make her tea. Tell her I'll stop by later to check on her too." Liam curled his fingers around the jar's smooth glass, and the warmth spread up his wrist. He thanked the woman, voice thick, and stepped back off the porch. He glanced over his shoulder at Jesus, and the small, steady smile on Jesus's face gave him more courage than he thought he had left. He shifted the honey jar into the crook of his arm, next to the wrapped bread and cheese, and turned toward the next cottage down the lane. The grass grew tall along the path, brushing against his bare ankles as he walked. He stopped at the second porch, wiped the dirt from the bottom of his feet on the edge of the step, and lifted his hand to knock. He rapped twice, sharp and clear, and waited. No footsteps came. No latch clicked. He knocked again, harder this time, and pressed his ear close to the door to listen. He could hear a clock ticking inside, slow and steady, but no sound of anyone moving toward the door. His shoulders slumped a little. What if no one was home? What if the next few doors were all empty, and all the kindness he had found so far would end right here? He shifted the heavy load in his arms, and the honey jar shifted against his ribs. He lifted his hand to knock a third time, just to be sure. Before his knuckles could hit the wood, the door swung inward a crack. A man's face peeked out, lined with sun and work, and he squinted against the bright daylight. "Liam?" he said. "What is it, lad?" Liam took a slow breath and told him everything again. The stolen bread, the sick mother, the baker's forgiveness, Jesus' advice to speak the truth. When he finished, the man pulled the door all the way open and nodded toward the garden plot behind his cottage. "Hold on a minute," he said. He walked out the back gate and came back a few minutes later, hefting a thick burlap sack over one shoulder. Dirt crumbled through the weave onto the porch boards as he set it down at Liam's feet. "Just dug these this morning," he said. "Full sack of new potatoes. They'll keep for weeks, and they'll fill more than a few bellies. Take them. I got plenty more in the root cellar." Liam knelt down, hooked one arm through the potato sack's tied top, and pushed up off his knees. The burlap scraped raw against his forearm, and the weight pulled his shoulder down, straining the muscles he already used carrying the bread, cheese, and honey. He adjusted his grip, shifting the sack to sit more evenly across his hip, and thanked the man again. The man clapped him on the shoulder, hard and warm, and told him to come back if he needed more. Liam nodded, turned, and started walking back toward the lane where Jesus waited, leaning against the split-rail fence. He had only taken 3 steps when he heard the rumble of wheels behind him. A heavy cart, pulled by a broad chestnut horse, was rolling down the lane toward him. Liam stepped quickly off the path, into the tall grass at the side, to get out of the way. He pressed the potato sack tighter against his body, expecting the driver to crack the whip and keep moving, or shout at him for loitering on the public road. Instead, the cart slowed. The driver pulled back on the reins, and the horse stopped right beside where Liam stood. The driver was the local farmer who kept the fields at the edge of the neighborhood. His face burned dark by the sun, his hands calloused from holding reins all day. "Is that you, Liam?" he called down from the driver's seat. "I heard what happened with the baker this morning. Heard you told the whole truth, even when it would have been easier to run." Liam nodded, his throat tight again, and shifted his load once more. He waited for the man to say something about theft, about bad blood, about the way boys like him end up. The farmer swung one leg over the side of the cart, jumped down to the dirt road, and walked around to the back of the wagon. Liam nodded, his eyes burning with the kind of heat that didn't come from anger or fear. He thanked the farmer, and the farmer just waved him off, climbed back into his cart, and rolled on down the lane. Jesus pushed off the fence, stepped beside Liam, and slid one arm under the heavy potato sack to take some of the weight off Liam's shoulder. The muscle under Liam's skin relaxed instantly, the sharp ache fading to a soft throb. They turned toward the cottage at the edge of town and started walking back. The sun hung low in the sky now, casting long, soft shadows across the dirt path. Liam's bare feet hit the packed earth step after step, and he counted the gifts in his head to keep track. 2 loaves of bread from the baker, a whole wheel of cheese, a jar of honey for tea, a full sack of potatoes, a whole plump chicken ready for soup. He'd never carried so much food in his whole life. Halfway down the last lane before the cottage, his foot caught on a loose stone jutting out of the path. He lurched forward, and the potato sack shifted against his side, the honey jar clinking sharp against the cheese wrapping. Jesus tightened his grip on the sack and pulled Liam steady before he could fall. Liam caught his breath, laughed a little shaky, and adjusted the load in his arms. No harm done. They walked the last 100 yards slow, steady, and stopped at the broken-down cottage door. Liam shifted the basket to one hand, reached up, and pushed the door open. The door creaked loud on its one good hinge, and they stepped inside. Liam's mother had pushed herself up against the wall, waiting, her thin hands folded in her lap. She looked at the load they carried, and her hand flew up to cover her mouth. Liam set the wicker basket down on the table by the window. The once empty basket bulged at the sides, every corner stuffed full, overflowing with food that neighbors had given freely. Liam stacked the last of the extra food on the single wooden table beside the basket, piling the potato sack at the base so it would not tip over. He stepped back, his bare feet flat on the cracked earthen floor, and just looked. Every surface held something given freely. No item was stolen, no piece was taken in the dark with trembling hands and a hammering heart. A warmth started low in his belly, soft and slow, and spread up through his chest, out to his fingertips, down to his toes. He thought at first it was just the hunger easing, the knowledge that his mother would eat tonight, that she would have the soup she needed to get strong. But it was deeper than that. When he had run through the alleys with the stolen loaf pressed to his ribs, every nerve had been tight with fear. Every sound had made him flinch. Every shadow had held an angry man waiting to beat him. That fear was gone. It had melted away the second he told the baker the whole truth, the second he bowed his head and offered to work for what he had taken. Now, there was no shadow of dread hanging over him, no knot in his throat, no urge to run and hide. He turned slowly and looked at Jesus standing by the fireplace, watching him with that quiet, unjudging smile. He understood then, honesty, courage, and kindness do not leave you empty. Liam walked across the room, his steps steady on the cracked floor, and reached out for Jesus' hand. The callous skin wrapped around his smaller palm, and a new strength flooded into his bones, solid and sure. From that moment, Liam held fast to the promise he had made. Every morning, he checked on his mother first, bringing her water to drink, propping her up against the wall, helping her cough into her cloth before he left the cottage. Then he walked the mile back into town, straight to the baker's shop behind the market square. He split every last stack of firewood before the sun climbed to midday. He hauled sacks of flour from the cart to the storeroom, one after another, until his arms burned and his palms were rubbed raw. He swept the floor behind the counters, emptied the ash from the oven, and carried out the trash before he took a single break. After he finished his work for the baker, he walked back through the neighborhood, stopping at every door that needed an extra pair of hands. He carried water for the widow who could no longer bend to haul it from the well. He ran errands to the market for the tailor whose knees were too stiff to make the walk. He mended broken fences and pulled weeds from garden rows, and helped the butcher tie up cuts of meat for his customers. The first 3 days were the hardest. By the time he walked back to the cottage each evening, every muscle in his body ached so bad he could barely climb the step through the door. His feet were blistered from walking so many miles every day. He wanted to stop, to cut corners, to do less than he had promised. But every time he felt that temptation, he thought of the empty food basket, of the warmth that had filled his chest when the neighbors handed him their gifts. He pushed through the ache. He kept his word. Every single day. He never took a single thing that was not his. A week passed just like that, steady and unhurried. By the 7th morning, his mother could sit up on her pallet for an hour at a time without tiring. Liam's hands had new calluses, his legs had new muscle, and his heart had no shadow left. That morning, Jesus said he was ready to continue his journey. Liam walked to the cottage doorway with him and stopped on the step. Before Jesus turned to walk down the road, Liam stepped out beside him onto the packed dirt outside the cottage. He scanned the edge of the lane, where a group of younger children chased a rolling hoop past the blackberry bushes. His fingers twisted together at his waist. He had never talked about his theft to anyone but the baker and Jesus. The old shame still pricked at the back of his throat. The memory of hiding in the alley. The fear of being called a thief in front of everyone he knew. But he thought of how that shame had kept him walking in the dark. How much lighter his life was now that he had dragged the truth into the open. He pulled his hand away from the doorframe, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the group of playing children. He stopped just outside their circle and waited until they noticed him, their game slowing to a stop. One by one, they turned to look at him. Liam took a deep breath and told them every word. He told them about the empty basket, about his sick mother, about stealing the loaf and running through the alleys, his heart hammering so hard he thought it would break. He told them about Jesus finding him, about walking back to the baker, about the baker giving them more bread, about the neighbors bringing food when he told them the truth. He told them what he had learned. He told them that fear makes you take what you do not need, that it traps you in the dark, that honest courage and kindness bring more than anything you can ever steal. He held out his hands, calloused from a week of work, and told them that the strength in those calluses was worth more than any loaf he ever could have taken. The last child had run off to resume their game, their chatter fading down the lane toward the common. Liam turned back to the cottage, his boots crunching on the loose gravel beside the step. Jesus waited for him just inside the doorway, one hand resting on the splintered doorframe. The morning breeze stirred the dust on the earthen floor, carrying the sweet scent of clover from the hayfield at the edge of town. A soft cough came from the corner by the pallet. Liam's mother pushed herself up on one elbow, her voice thinner than it had been a week before, but steady now, no longer shaking with fever. She looked at Jesus, and her eyes glistened with the tears she did not bother to wipe away. She said, "I have no way to repay you. You pulled my boy out of the dark when I had no strength left to pull him myself. You gave us back more than just bread. You gave us back our courage. I will pray for you every day, that your journey keeps you safe, that every heart you touch finds the same light my boy found here." Jesus nodded and walked to the edge of the pallet. He bent and pressed his hand lightly to her forehead, and the tension in her shoulders softened. Just like that, he said, "Your faith has already healed you, more than any medicine. It will stay with your son, and it will stay with you all the days of your life." He stepped back from the pallet and walked back out through the door to the dirt road. Liam stayed on the threshold, his hand brushing the splintered edge of the door, and watched Jesus adjust the strap of his pack over his shoulder. The morning sun filtered through the oak trees at the end of the lane, dappling the packed dirt with patches of light and shadow. Jesus turned and smiled at Liam and started walking down the road. Jesus' boots crunched soft over the packed dirt, each step carrying him further from the cottage toward the curve in the road that would take him out of sight. Liam did not move. He kept his feet planted on the threshold, one hand curled tight around the splintered wood of the doorframe. The morning sun slanted over the rooftops of the town behind him, warming the back of his neck, gilding the dust that stirred in the light breeze. He could hear his mother's slow, steady breathing from the pallet inside, soft and even, no longer ragged with coughs. A flicker of the old fear tickled the back of his throat, the same cold dread he had felt pressed against the alley brick, waiting for angry hands to yank him out. For a second, He could feel the stolen loaf digging into his ribs, could taste the copper of fear on his tongue. He squeezed the doorframe harder. The splinter bit into the pad of his thumb, a sharp, clear reminder of where he stood now. He was not hiding. He had nothing left to hide. Every person who needed to know knew what he had done. He had said it out loud, 100 times over, to children and neighbors and the baker. The shame that used to cling to his bones like wet mud had washed away with every word of truth he spoke. He breathed in the warm morning air and let the flicker of fear die out, slow and steady. His shoulders did not slump. His hand did not shake. He kept it curled around the doorframe, strong and steady, as Jesus rounded the curve of the road. The truth was his now. It would not leave him. He would not let it go. Jesus rounded the curve and disappeared from view. Liam did not look away for a long moment. He let his eyes stay on the empty stretch of road and let the events of the past 2 weeks unfold in his mind, one by one. He remembered the feel of the stolen rye bread digging into his ribs, cold and hard, a secret that burned through his coat even before he ran. He remembered pressing his back to the alley brick, waiting for the beatings and the shame that he thought he deserved. He remembered Jesus kneeling in the mud, his voice soft, no anger, no judgment. He remembered walking back to the market, his throat tight enough to close, saying every word of the truth out loud to the baker. He remembered the baker handing him 3 loaves instead of 1, and how the warmth of that kindness seeped into his hands, all the way up to his shoulders. He remembered knocking on every door in the neighborhood, standing tall and telling every neighbor what he had done and what he needed. He remembered the neighbors piling food into his arms, one gift after another, until his empty basket overflowed. Liam pulled his hand away from the doorframe at last and turned back into the cottage. The air smelled of chicken soup and fresh bread, and the fire crackled soft in the fireplace. His mother smiled when he walked in and held out a hand to him. He sat on the edge of her pallet and wrapped his fingers around hers, and the truth stayed right where it was, solid and warm in his chest. 3 months later, the lesson found its first test. Liam was carrying firewood back from the baker's yard when he kicked a leather purse half buried in the mud by the market gate. He fished it out, opened the flap, and counted 12 copper coins inside, more money than he had held in his whole life up to that point. For half a second, he thought of the empty larder, of his mother's cough that still lingered some mornings, of how easily he could tuck this purse into his pocket and no one would know. He did not even have to steal it. It was just there, waiting. He turned the purse over in his hands and remembered the feel of the stolen loaf digging into his ribs, the cold dread that had lived in his throat for days before Jesus found him. He did not hesitate. He walked straight to the market fountain, where the town crier announced lost goods, and turned the purse over, every copper still inside. The owner was a merchant who had dropped it an hour before, and he gave Liam a copper as a reward for his honesty. That small coin bought more peace than any stolen loaf ever could. Year after year, this small lesson guided him. When he was hungry, he knocked on doors instead of slipping into dark alleys. When he made a mistake, he spoke the truth instead of hiding. When he saw other boys and girls caught in the same fear he had known, he told them his story, just as Jesus had asked. When he grew old and had children and grandchildren of his own, he told them the story too, of the day a man knelt in the mud to show him the way. That gentle lesson of honesty and grace never left him. It guided every choice, every step, every beat of his heart for the rest of his life.